Welcome to the third in a series of 4 modules focused on implementing person-centered support in the community. This program builds on the Tier 1 series, which provided an overview of person-centered care, communication with people with dementia, understanding behavioral expressions, medical and clinical aspects of dementia, as well as complex information and referral issues. Tier 2 modules have been developed for options counselors, Medicaid case managers, OPI case managers, adult protective services providers, and others who assist people with dementia and their families plan for their futures as they live with dementia. As with Tier 1, the Tier 2 training modules will be most meaningful if you take each module in sequence. We will be featuring the characters and concepts that were introduced in Modules 5 and 6. This module will focus on supporting people with dementia and their families as they experience care transitions. Recall from earlier modules that several areas of competency for options counselors are consistent with person-centered planning. In Module 7, we will emphasize knowledge of private and public resources and follow-up with consumers. In Module 5, we introduced the team performance model, demonstrated some tools supporting person-centered planning, and introduced our cast of characters. Remember that the scenarios portrayed in this module are presented by actors. In Module 6, we talked about setting goals with families, developing and implementing person-centered plans, and more tools to support person-centered planning. The objectives of today's modules are that you will understand the differences between dementia, depression, and delirium, be able to describe common care transitions experienced by persons living with dementia, understand the risks to the person living with dementia associated with various care transitions, and finally, be able to support families and others to reduce adverse effects of transitions for people living with dementia and their families. We have used the team performance model adapted by Patty Cotton and Susan Fox for use in person-centered planning by options counselors and case managers. In Module 5, we discussed the components of orientation and trust building. In Module 6, we talked about identifying goals and roles, making commitments to a plan, and implementing a plan. As we talk about transitions associated with dementia, we will talk about performance and renewal. Let's take a look at the definitions of those terms. First, performance. In our stories, the person-centered plans worked well at first. The people with dementia, Sarah, Dennis, and Martha, felt supported. Sarah and Dennis's family had established patterns of communication, and for a while they could adapt as Sarah and Dennis became more dependent on them for support. Martha's situation was more precarious because she was without family or other natural supports. As a result, her options counselor checked in with her more frequently. As the disease progressed, additional planning and new actions were required because the original plans were no longer working. In the performance model, this is called renewal. As we go through this module, we will talk about how the transitions that occur often require renewal. Examples will be demonstrated in this module. Part of the role of the options counselor is to follow up with individuals and their families. Because options counseling is done on a relatively short-term basis, a follow-up call is often done a few weeks after a final visit. The options counselor will check to see where the individual and family are in their planning and/or their implementation of a plan. If needed, the options counselor can support changes in the plan or extend their involvement. Once the family team is performing well, however, the options counselor will close the case, and it will be up to the person or a family member to initiate contact if a renewal phase is required. A case manager may have a longer-term relationship with an individual and may become aware that a new plan is needed. It is helpful for the options counselor or case manager to make themselves available and let families know how to contact them if needs change. We will now discuss transitions that occur throughout the disease progression of dementia. From the time people begin to notice symptoms of dementia, transitions begin to occur. The first involves psychological and social adaptations. This begins with the person with dementia, but the family, friends, and other people who are important to them will experience psychological and social transitions as well. As the disease progresses, changes are also required in their physical environments. This can include home modifications, dealing with driving, or getting help at home. People with dementia have a higher likelihood than their age peers without dementia to be hospitalized. Finally, many people with dementia transition to a residential setting, including adult care homes, assisted living, residential care facilities, or nursing facilities. As discussed in the Tier 1 modules, Many people with dementia experience challenges to their identity as they experience losses that no longer allow them to do many of the things that were central to who they were. Recall how individuals with dementia experience stigma and loss of personhood. A major psychological transition, then, is to have an identity as a person living with dementia. Remember how in Module 6, Sarah felt invisible, marginalized, set apart from everyone she cared about and everything that was meaningful to her. As the disease progresses, the psychological transitions continue. Not only does the person have a progressive disease, but they assume a role as a person with dementia who increasingly needs support and supervision. Sarah told her husband that she was capable of making herself some tea without burning the house down. That will change, and with that change, Sarah will experience another loss of competence for her daily living and her ability to manage her daily routines. You might remember from Module 6 that Bill was haunted by the memory of his mother-in-law who also had Alzheimer's disease. He remembered his wife's burdens and the disruption of their family when his mother-in-law lived with them for 2 years. At that time, his mother-in-law's many behaviors were not understood to be expressions of unmet need. When Sarah was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, Bill did not realize how much had changed in best practices to support people with dementia. He also had no idea that there were so many options that are available to support people with dementia and their families. With his mother-in-law, there had been no support groups, brochures, guidelines, or websites. The only option to providing total care for his mother-in-law was the nursing home. With Sarah's dementia, Bill assumed many new roles. During their marriage, Sarah had done most of the household chores, and as her disease progressed, Bill had to take on those responsibilities while maintaining most of his own. He also needed to learn to relate with Sarah in new ways. The transition from daughter to caregiver of a person with dementia was particularly difficult for Sally. You may remember that when we first met Dennis's daughter in Module 5, she was overwhelmed and unprepared to be a caregiver. She had no awareness of the disease or how it affected her father. She attributed his inability to work a new microwave, manage his own medications, or to realize how late he was calling her, to being spoiled by her mother. As the options counselor gained the trust of Dennis's daughters, she encouraged them to learn more about dementia, connecting them with Alzheimer's and dementia support groups. She also explained why Dennis was responding the way he did. Lola, Dennis's other daughter, took on the role of researching and learning as much as she could. She shared this information with Sally, who over time came to understand the disease better. As a result, Sally's relationship with both Dennis and her sister improved. Sally also worried a lot about what would happen to her father and to the family as a whole. These worries were also behind the great frustration she experienced and expressed to the options counselor in their first meeting. The options counselor provided the information she needed about dementia and ways to support Dennis and herself. She also worked with the family to identify and define their new roles as caregivers. Although Dennis remains her parent, as his disease progresses, she will learn to relate to him in new ways. People with dementia are at elevated risk for depression throughout the progression of their disease, from the very beginning through toward the end of life. The risk for depression in people with dementia is high, in part because of the threats to one's identity. This may happen, for example, when someone has to give up the car keys, quit working, or can no longer do the things they have always been good at. Like dementia, the onset of depression occurs over weeks and months. Dementia and depression are often confused. When both are present, one condition may go unnoticed, because depression will mask dementia, and dementia will mask depression. Depression can stem from many different causes. It can be more prevalent in some families than in others. Some of these causes include the biochemical changes in the brain. Sometimes these are triggered by prescription or over-the-counter drugs. Some illnesses, such as heart disease and dementia, are associated with depression. Vision and hearing changes can lead to isolation and therefore to depression. Stress is another cause. This might be the stress of living in an environment that is increasingly complex and confusing, or the stress of caregiving. Living in the Northwest, we know that some people experience depression in the winter months, especially when it is wet and dreary. People with a history of major depression have a higher risk of developing dementia in later life, and people with dementia have an elevated risk for depression regardless of history of depression. Many symptoms are associated with depression, As I list some of the common symptoms, think about which symptoms are similar to those of dementia. Common symptoms of depression include loss of interest or pleasure in activities, a depressed mood, sadness, feelings of emptiness, feeling slowed down or restless, self-neglect, impaired attention, impaired information processing, feeling worthless or guilty, thoughts of death or suicide, increase or decrease in appetite, trouble sleeping or sleeping too much, loss of energy, fatigue, and problems thinking, making decisions, and concentrating. Symptoms that are common to both dementia and depression are loss of interest or pleasure in activities, self-neglect, impaired attention, impaired information processing, and problems thinking, concentrating, and making decisions. Throughout this training program, we have stressed the importance of getting a thorough and complete physical, psychological, and cognitive exam. This is especially important in situations where there may be both depression and dementia. Sometimes dementia symptoms can be reversed when a major depression is treated. You may remember that in the modules on person-centered decision support that Sarah had been treated for depression. Recall that the options counselor described Sarah's family as smothering her. This was a good example of excess safety in the early stages of the disease that contributed to Sarah's depression. Here is how Sarah describes that time.
After the kids were grown and my mother died, I became a full-time volunteer. I loved it. I used to play in a community orchestra, and I even helped them with fundraising. I volunteered 3 mornings a week at the hospital gift shop, and I drove 2 days a week for Meals on Wheels. And then when Bill would be reading or watching TV, I made doll furniture. Most of this was donated for various fundraisers. I noticed that some things were not quite right. Well, first it got really hard learning music, and that should have been easy. And then I had trouble making change at the gift shop. I really knew something was wrong when I got lost trying to deliver meals. I had had that route for years, and even though the people changed, the neighborhoods didn't. I think Bill noticed some things too. The doctor did some tests and told me I likely had Alzheimer's disease. It was horrible. I kept seeing my mother in that nursing home and remembered how exhausted I was caring for her. I was so frightened. Bill was great, but he was never the one who took care of the kids when they were sick, and he did do some housework when my mother lived with us, but he just couldn't help me take care of her. I kept thinking of all that I was going to miss. My grandchildren were babies. I'd never know them when they grew up. Bill's health isn't all that great, and I didn't know how he was going to manage. I told him to put me in a home, but he wouldn't hear of it. I just really got down in the dumps. I didn't want to do anything, and Bill hovered over me until I thought I would scream. And then I broke my foot. Hospital was horrible. It was so confusing. I was grateful for Bill's hovering then. After I got home, a nurse came to the house, and she asked a bunch of questions about how I was feeling. She talked to Bill, and then we went to the doctor for my foot, and he asked me those same questions and a bunch more. They had nothing to do with my foot. Anyway, he told us he thought I was depressed and prescribed some medicine. About a month later, I realized that I was feeling a lot more hopeful, and some of my forgetfulness was probably because of the depression. I found there was still a lot I could do.
Note that Sarah's memory improved following treatment. Depression in a person with dementia is treatable. In addition to the medication that Sarah received for her depression, the person-centered plan that she and her family developed, with the assistance of the options counselor, also helped her maintain her identity as a contributing member of her family and her community. This was critical in preventing a recurrence of depression. As we saw in Module 6, she was a full participant in planning for her care and she continued to pursue her interests successfully for a long time. As Sarah declined and could no longer work at the gift shop, Bill enrolled her in an adult day program where she could work on crafts and socialize with others, thereby meeting her needs for creativity and Bill's need for respite. Sarah is not the only one at risk of depression. Over a quarter of family caregivers suffer from depression. Because she was diagnosed prior to her 65th birthday, Sarah is one of the 5% of those with dementia with younger onset Alzheimer's disease. Although many caregivers of those with dementia may be at increased risk for depression and feelings of burden, these risks seem to be particularly high for those with younger onset dementia. These families face more years of caregiving, and the disease interrupts many developmental tasks of middle and early old age. Over half of these caregivers experience mild to severe depression. Caregiving spouses may be at more risk of experiencing loneliness. Caregiving can be very isolating as dependency grows and the relationship with the person with dementia changes. They may no longer remember shared life events or be able to engage in the same types of conversations or activities that defined them as a couple. Early transitions experienced by families will include changing roles to include increasing oversight and monitoring of the person with dementia, making the environment supportive and safe, and perhaps engaging outside assistance. This role shift, a term preferred to that of role reversal, is often quite difficult and painful for family members as well as the person with dementia. Bill and Sarah are lucky that Sarah received a diagnosis early. This helped them to be more proactive in their planning. Their children were supportive, so they avoided high levels of conflict found in many families. This might be because their children were adults themselves. In many families where there is onset of dementia at an early age, children may still be living at home and trying to navigate adolescence and young adulthood. Because Sarah was in her early 60s, most aging services were available to her. Those younger than 60 often have great difficulty accessing services. A major stress for Bill, however, is that he retired much sooner than he expected or wanted. Work played a central role for Bill, and he was good at it. This was the way he contributed to the community and to his family. His early retirement not only affected their current financial situation, but the decision could negatively impact Bill's identity as a provider and put him at risk financially as he ages. The ADRC and its partners can help people with dementia and their families navigate the psychological transitions. Providing person-centered decision support can contribute to detecting depression and intervening early. It can also give individuals and their families greater understanding about dementia and the skills needed to provide person-centered support. Specifically, options counselors can help keep the person in the forefront. Explore values, needs, and preferences from the person's perspective early and often. Identify what is important to and important for the person. Include family members' perspectives in what is working and what is not working. And help plan and prepare for future transitions, and importantly, provide resources. Here are some additional resources for options counselors and case managers, as well as for family members and other caregivers. ADRCs provide training and materials families can use to enhance knowledge and skills. Self-assessments are useful for families in monitoring their own well-being and capacity for caregiving. ADRCs have a specific page on the website dedicated to Alzheimer's disease and related support. The Family Caregiver Alliance is a national organization that supports and sustains the important work of families nationwide caring for loved ones with chronic, disabling health conditions. It has information on Alzheimer's disease and caregiving. Among its resources is information for long-distance caregivers. The Alzheimer's Association nationally provides support 24 hours a day by telephone 7 days a week. This is available in multiple languages. In addition, they have information specific to younger onset Alzheimer's and offer local support groups and educational programs. The options counselor for Sarah and Bill told them about support groups offered through the Alzheimer's Association. Sarah attended a support group for several months. Initially, Bill chose not to. He used the time that Sarah attended her support group to pursue some of his interests, which helped to renew him. The Alzheimer's Network primarily serves the Mid-Willamette Valley and offers a variety of educational and support services. Transitions also occur in people's living situations. We will talk next about transitioning at home, transitioning to and from the hospital, and transitioning to a residential care setting. Safety is a major concern for those who live at home, either alone or with others, particularly as the disease progresses. Concerns mentioned most frequently by family members include driving, medication management, falls, cooking, getting adequate nutrition, and getting lost. Driving was an issue with Martha and will be discussed further with the next slide. Dennis's daughter worried about his medications and about him getting lost. She learned about the Safe Return Medic Alert program through the Alzheimer's Association and medication reminders available by phone. Resources to address all of these issues are available through the ADRC and Alzheimer's website. One of the most complex and painful transitions confronting someone with dementia is related to driving. Driving is associated with adulthood, independence, competence, and quality of life. Giving up driving can be very difficult emotionally and psychologically. Inability to drive represents dependence, and often the loss of an important part of a person's identity. It is also challenging for families and other care partners who frequently are the first to recognize that driving is no longer safe. They often step in to provide or arrange for transportation, which hastens changes in their relationship with the person with dementia. They are increasingly in charge of the person's daily life. In early stages of Alzheimer's disease, an individual can often drive safely, but as the disease progresses, this will no longer be possible. Some signs that someone is no longer safe include forgetting how to locate familiar places, failing to observe traffic signals, making slow or poor decisions while driving, driving at inappropriate speeds, and returning from a routine drive later than usual. When driving is an issue, family members may need to talk to the person about their need to stop driving. Ask a doctor to write a do not drive prescription. Control access to the car keys. Disable the car or keep it out of sight, and have the person evaluated by a driving rehabilitation specialist. All of these resources and more are available through the Alzheimer's Association website. Because of their multiple vulnerabilities, people with dementia are at greater risk for hospitalization. Causes of hospitalization typically have to do with infections, breathing difficulties, delirium, and falls. People with dementia are also more vulnerable to adverse experiences related to outcomes. This includes a decline in mobility and reduced ability to take care of personal care needs such as getting dressed or using the toilet. It is often helpful if family members can talk to health professionals before the hospitalization. This can help them avoid some of the adverse outcomes, or the providers can help the family make decisions about avoiding the hospital stay altogether. As we will discuss in Module 8, it may be wise to forego hospitalization if the individual has a POLST form or a do not resuscitate order and can be kept comfortable where they are, whether at home or in a residential care facility. Here is Susan Denser, editor of Health Affairs, discussing the challenges of transitions related to hospitalization.